Good morning and welcome to this morning's webinar, which focuses on carbon lifecycle assessments and the role it has to play in net zero strategy. My name is George Richards. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a director at JRP Solutions, and this is the latest in a series of webinars in which we choose to share our knowledge and information with our clients and a broader net zero audience. So please keep an eye out for future webinars. But today I'm joined by a number of contributors. As you can see, next slide, please, Rob. We're joined by Dr. Enes Ünal, who's a lecturer in circular economy and innovation at Cranfield. Dr. Gavin Milligan, who's a senior associate in sustainability. Stephen Kyle Henney, who's managing director at TISIX. And Carol Sumper, who's our Director of Sustainability here at JRP. We will be taking questions throughout. There is a Q&A function, so please feel free to use it. And we will, depending how much time is available at the end of the webinar, we'll attempt to address as many of those questions as possible. So without further hesitation, I'd like to hand over to Enes. Next slide, please, Rob.
All right. Hello from Cranfield University. I'm Dr. Enes Ünal. As George introduced me, I'm a lecturer in circular economy and innovation. So today I will be talking about, briefly, introduction to circular economy and what is the relevance of life cycle assessment to achieve a circular economy. So next slide, please. Yeah, we can continue. Before doing that, I just want to give you a brief background about myself to let you better understand the research I'm doing. So my background is that I graduated from a PhD in the School of Management in Politecnico di Milano, where the design and the management is kind of strengths in that country. Then I have been around Europe in many institutions, including KTH, Royal Institute of Technology, and the Politecnica de Madrid. And finally, I landed in Cranfield University in the beginning of 2020 as a lecturer in the Center for Design. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is our center. Maybe some of you know already who have been in Cranfield University. And what we do is in that center is that we provide MDES courses, MSc for Design Thinking, and we address global challenges. This is a cross-cutting in a university fund center. So basically, we provide solutions to the industrial and the management challenges. Next slide, please. And we do that by leveraging our capabilities. So addressing global challenges and the grand challenges is a multidisciplinary area field. That's why we integrate all these technologies and the sciences together to address those wicked and the challenging problems. So we have an idea space, workshop space that we create design ideas, as well as we have engineering and then also management parts in that center. As you can see, we have assembly areas, 3D printing kind of workshops, and then manufacturing facilities as well. Next slide, please. So we start with the premises of criticizing our current economy, the linear economy. So what we say is that our current economy is hugely wasteful. So considering or giving some examples, almost 30% of the food globally produced are already waste. So we just only consume 70%, 69% of this food. And the 20% is the value chain waste, and the 11% is the consumer waste. And consider an average European car in transport industry. 92% of time, average European car is parked, is not used, the resource is not utilized. And also, if we consider that the way we work, or we used to work before COVID as well, European offices spends is 60% of time empty, not used. So this gives us a question that how our current economy is functioning, whether we are effectively or efficiently utilizing these resources. So next slide, please. To address these challenges, circular economy emerged as a paradigm through the last 10 years. Of course, you can trace back the school of thoughts before that, last 10 years. Like maybe you can go to 1960s with Balding and the Spaceship Earth, economics of Spaceship Earth. But it penetrated to the management and the engineering literature around last 10, 15 years. Having analyzed the definitions in the literature, Critcher suggests that most of the time, these definitions are focusing on the economic prosperity, around half of them. And the 38% is focusing on environmental quality, but only marginal part is focusing on the social equity and the fairness. So this gives you an idea that how we approach circular economy. And I suspect the number of definitions as of now in 2022 maybe exceeded 200 or 250. Next slide, please. But just to give you a brief idea about what is a circular economy or how it can be understood. And I give you the most adopted definitions by Ellen MacArthur Foundations, a driving force, an NGO of circular economy. So the circular economy is a system solution framework that tackles global challenges like climate change, biodiversity loss, waste, and pollution. But at the same time, circular economy is an industrial system, restorative and regenerative by intention and the design. So what we understand from these definitions, actually, so circular economy at the same time means the coexistence of human industry with the nature in a mutually supportive manner. So we don't take actions or produce at the expense of environment or the society. Next slide, please. And I would like to mention what is the core of circular economy and how you would understand this. Basically, you need to understand the material flow, the flow of resources. And it is, of course, we can talk about tangible resources or intangible resources, but I'll just give you an example of like the resources from the industry. So cradle to cradle design framework suggests basically two material cycles. On the left-hand side, you see biological cycle, which is the safe to dispose material. When you use, you can return back to the soil and it becomes nutrient for the environment. But on the other side, on the right side, you see technical nutrients. So the idea here is that you perpetually cycle these nutrients, these materials in a loop without any quality loss, so that there's like you minimize the leakages in the system. So this is the idea, like having two cycles, material cycles in the circular economy. Next slide, please. And having leveraged this framework, design framework of cradle to cradle, Ellen MacArthur provided a butterfly diagram. So if you ask me, this is a picture of circular economy to explain the value chain and the industrial practices, you know, like how a circular economy functions. So the idea here is that, again, you see on the left side, the biological cycle, and on the right-hand side, the technical cycle, together with the practices, relevant practices. And the priority here is that you need to keep yourself always in inner circle. If you see the practices, maintenance, reuse, refurbish, and recycle. So if you have a chance to maintain a device or any system, you would go for that option, which is like more impactful and leads higher circularity than refurbishing or recycling. And this kind of diagram gives you the idea is that recycling is not kind of ultimate circular economy, and it is a last resort if you don't have any other option. And on the left-hand side, you see the biological circle, which is basically you returning the materials back to the biosphere in several different ways, by digestion, biogas, or like a basic just composting. Next slide, please. And also, it is important to understand the practices or the strategies of implementation of these practices. So basically, our current industry, the linear systems, are obsessed with the efficiency, which is doing more with less. So we always aspire for that. Yeah, there might be nothing wrong with that, but if you ask like whether the nature itself is efficient, I would answer this question as no, but it is rather effective, which leads to the intended goal. So basically, what we should, or circular economy aspires for, is optimizing the positive impact rather than the reducing the negative impact. It is the choice between being less bad or being good. And you see on the left-hand side, the practices, like again, the recycling, which is the like the start, but the minimum impact. And you see on the top, which is the rethinking, the way that we are making things. So this is the questioning the dominant assumptions and the challenge them by introducing innovations. And the next slide, please. And finally, I just would like to talk about what is the relevance of life cycle assessment for circular economy. So there is a standard institution, ISO, which introduced the standards and the frameworks for both circular economy and the life cycle assessment. And if you have a closer look at these like frameworks, you would see that to a certain extent they are overlapping in terms of like a goal and the scope definitions. But what I can say is that LCA complements and it provides evidence for circular economy decision making. So LCA is a good start to provide evidences. So what you need to be careful about is that you are making a lot of assumptions when you are using these tools, including LCA. So just make sure that the assumptions you are making are aligned with the logical reasoning. And remember that there is no manual, or there was no manual for Industrial Revolution, the first, the second, and third Industrial Revolution. And there is no one way, one correct way of doing things. So what I can say is that the innovation and the design is key to achieve circular economy, and the LCA is a good start to understand where you are positioning, what is your impact, and how you can improve that. But you should always have a room for innovation rather than optimizing the current linear systems. So having said that, yeah, I finalize my presentation and give floor to the other speakers. I believe that they will be talking more in depth about LCA.
Thank you, Enis. That was very insightful. And now over to Carol.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to give you a high-level view of how life cycle assessment fits into net zero, and then you'll get more detail from Gavin following on. So next slide, please. You could consider life cycle assessment to be a form of sustainability assessment ultimately, because it's looking at the interaction between social, economic and environmental pillars or components of a sustainable society. And a good sustainability assessment covers all of these things. Life cycle assessment tends to really focus on a product or a material. And it's touched on the international standards. The standard for full life cycle assessment from an environmental component, looking at carbon, energy, water, ecotoxicity, is ISO 14044. But there are also specific standards for particular types of product. There's an LCA standard for seafood, because that has particular issues in the supply chain. And similarly for apparel, for clothing. And there are very particular issues around that, and you'll get more of that information in one of our case studies later on. So we're talking specifically this morning about carbon life cycle assessment in relation to achieving net zero. And I think Enis has given us a really good explanation of why circularity, systems thinking is important to get to net zero, because ultimately net zero is about getting back to being in harmony with nature, with natural systems, so that we're not creating excessive greenhouse gas emissions. And it's also useful to think, the United Nations have done a lot of work around life cycle assessment and life cycle initiatives. And they talk about it as a way of thinking that includes the economic, environmental and social consequences of a product or process over its entire life cycle, from cradle to grave. Although Ellis is started as thinking in the right way, talking about cradle to cradle. So next slide, please. This is just a quick overview of the relationship between the family of the international standards around life cycle thinking, and how that works with life cycle carbon in assessment, which is ISO 14067, and how you need to have your scoped out inventory, your project documentation and reports, how you're putting your data together, and then how you're putting your ultimate report together. So you're being very logical about it, and it's worth looking at all of these things if you're thinking about starting an ISO 14067 compliant carbon life cycle assessment, so that you've got the context for it. Next slide, please. I think in pictures, so I find it really useful to literally map out the system boundary for a life cycle assessment, and it's exactly the same in the way that you would map out your boundary for your life cycle your zero carbon strategy to get to net zero. And going back to the cradle to grave concept of how we use things at the moment, we take raw materials and put them through a manufacturing process. That's when you get to the gate, then they go off out into the economy, they get bought and used, and then we have end of life, so things get thrown away. But we all know now that there is no way. There are consequences for where things end up. And if you look at the bottom dashed line, this is the ecological loop, the cradle to cradle. How can we get into that virtuous thinking of circularity, so that we are not wasting anything, that we eliminate waste, because waste should be the raw feedstock, the food for another system. And so thinking about things in this way is really helpful. We can see that at every stage of a manufacturing cycle there is waste, and there are elements, there are points in that cycle where we can reuse. That's the virtuous smallest cycle. And this has talked about recycling being the last resort to get into a good system, but if we can think about systems thinking and keeping in that ecological virtuous loop, then we're doing well. It's really important to map out and draw out the components of what you want to do in a life cycle assessment. Next slide, please. And for carbon life cycle assessment, there are essentially five basic steps. The raw materials, what do you need to make what you're making? What's the processing and manufacturing stage? How does that work? What energy and other materials do you need to make the component that you're making? Transportation is involved in virtually all of these stages, from the transportation of the raw materials to the processing site. There could be several elements to that processing procedure, so that there are several sites involved in that, with transportation, the link between all of them. And then the processing of raw materials into raw components can still go on to a further manufacturing stage, so that you have to factor in transportation in every stage of the process, through to when you get to the factory gate, it's going out into the economy, it's going out to retailers, it could be going out to wholesalers, to retailers, from retailers the consumer takes it home. There are sequences to the transportation story through a life cycle assessment that need to be mapped out. You need to think about what type of vehicle, what type of transportation, because ultimately the whole purpose of a life cycle assessment is to find out where are the main issues and how can we resolve them. And particularly if you're a manufacturer, it's how can we remake, how can we re-engineer our manufacturing process so that we make it better. And I've given a little a diagram here of those main stages, and I've also given a reference to Leila Akarogu's disruptive design article, and she's also done TED Talks around this, because disruptive design is about literally stopping something that's happening at the moment and changing it radically, and the change should be to radically improve it, so it should be a positive thing. And it's really important to think back down the whole supply chain, down your whole process, and see where you can make those positive disruptions and do things differently. And again, I've said this before, a really good question to pose in this is to think, what would good look like if we changed something and improved it? How can we get rid of the bad? Exactly. Next slide, please. So if you go back to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol diagram of the 3 scopes, and you're thinking about net zero, you can factor those 5 stages of the life cycle carbon assessment into the 3 scopes from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and look at it from a carbon accounting perspective. So your upstream scope 3 impacts are around raw material extraction, transportation, and then processing and manufacture. And there's a lot going on up there that you need to find out about as part of your carbon LCA. And then if you look downstream, you've got transportation, further processing and manufacturing of products, components, their in-use phase, and then end of life. And obviously, scope 1 in the middle is very much about the, depending on where you are in that life cycle, your own on-site direct combustion on-site, different type of natural gas, LPG, whatever. So it maps onto the Greenhouse Gas Protocol really well. Next slide, please. So coming back to the system boundary, your system boundary definition is really important for your own scopes, materials, on-site operations, and then thinking about the end use. And the hamburger diagram is really helpful here, because it helps you to start thinking about how far do you need to go back down the supply chain. And this diagram very neatly shows you can divide. It's not just about the hamburger, the product you're buying, it's also about what it comes wrapped in. What's that wrapper made of? Is it made of paper or is it made of plastic? Because that takes you down to different endpoints in the raw material supply chain. And then if you're using a plastic wrapper and you're going back to the oil and petrochemical industry, you're also going back to the electricity used to make the wrapper. What are your sources of electricity? You can go back further. So it's important to determine in your system boundary, how far back are you going? Document what's in scope for you, what's out of scope, and it's worth still having in your map of your system boundary what's out of scope and why. You must be very clear on the rationale that you're using for what's in and what's being excluded. And you need to be alert to the unintended consequences of trying to make things better. And there are very important reasons for why you need to try and work out what those unintended consequences are. Because ultimately, we're doing carbon life cycle assessment to do better, to make things better, to be regenerative and restorative. So if we go to the next slide, this is a really nice system boundary map, and it's giving different boundaries around different elements. And this is about using a drop-in fuel for aviation fuel to decarbonize aviation fuel. And if we look at the green line is about well to gate. So it's being very defined about the well to gate aspects that need to be looked at, from the energy and resources being used and the emissions of material waste resulting from that. And then if we look at the red line is looking about well to pump. So that's adding in one extra stage in the process to get the fuel into the aircraft. And then the combustion in the aircraft on its own is the yellow line. So that's totally about what's happening in the aircraft itself. You also have to ask the question, what sort of aircraft? How big or how small? What's its level of rate of fuel consumption? Those things have to be taken into account as well. You have to define the aircraft that you're looking at, or the different types of aircraft, so that you're going to have other little boxes, system boundaries in that on its own. The same thing happens if you're looking at the storage element within your well to pump. Not the storage, and also the type of transportation. You need to go back into your well to gate, your system boundary, and look at what sort of feedstock extraction. You have to define that. What sort of transport to get it from the point of extraction to the refinery, what sort of refining process. You have to document all of these things in detail. Then you can wrap the whole thing up in the blue line, which is your full system boundary. And as part of your study, you may be working with partners who are looking at each of these different things in the green, the red, the yellow lines, the boundaries, and they're detailing those different elements in those different boundaries. And you need to confer to make sure that you're working along the same assumptions, that you're using the same sources of emissions conversion factors, and where you're getting those from. You may be able to get them from a published source, or you may be having to go back to the partners involved, the businesses undertaking each of these processes, to see that if you can get their actual data. So it can be very complicated. I've given the reference there. You can go into that reference and look in more detail about how this study was actually done. If we go back to the next, if we go on to the next slide, I've talked about unintended consequences. You've got to try and be as informed as you possibly can. There are some fantastic examples of where the desire to do good has resulted in some terrible catastrophes. On the left-hand side at the bottom, we've got the African cane toad. It was imported to South America to help get rid of bugs and pests in sugarcane plantations. So the Australians thought, we'll do the same thing. They imported the cane toad to Australia, and there are no natural predators for the cane toad, and it's running riot in parts of Australia and decimating the local ecology. Vegware, great, an alternative to plastic, only if you have the right system to take the waste from what is still essentially a single-use item and make sure that you can get it into a properly composted system. If you can't, it ends up going to energy from waste, more emissions. Soya, you need to know where your soya is being grown and how it's being grown. So if you're getting European grown soya under sustainable conditions, good. If it's coming from South America, if it's having an impact on the rainforest ecology and that on the global climate, that's not good. Diesel, go back to the Gordon Brown government, where diesel was being promoted as a more sustainable fuel over petrol. We all know the outcome of that, and particulate story and air quality impacts on health, particularly in urban areas. So it's important to understand the nexus between the energy, food and water planetary boundaries. We are talking about working within planetary frameworks, goes back to the circularity and the systems that Enes was talking about when we started. So bear that in mind. There's a reference there to a recent paper on Nexus Research and trying to work out what is avoidable, what do we consider to be unavoidable and unknowable. I'm not going to quote Donald Rumsfeld, but it's getting into that kind of territory. But we have to think about this. This must be uppermost in our minds. Next slide, please. A really good example of secondary research is the Levi life cycle assessment, looking at the impact, not just carbon, but other environmental impacts of making a pair of jeans. And Levi update their LCA regularly, fairly regularly. So you need to, when you're undertaking a carbon LCA, do some good secondary research, do a literature review, find out what's known. RAP is a really good source for that as well, before you start embarking on your primary research, going back down your supply chain, talking to suppliers and their suppliers and their suppliers. Next slide, please. There are good data sets available as part of your secondary research to help you with your primary research. If you're in the construction sector, you should probably be familiar with eTool. That's a really useful tool to buy a license for, to use. All of these tools are compliant with ISO 14044, with other standards out there. I've got the logo there for EcoInvent, and this is a really good set of databases provided by EcoInvent, based in Zurich, Switzerland. They're a not-for-profit organisation dedicated to the availability of high-quality data for what they call sustainability assessments. So LCA is very much part of the bigger sustainability picture. There's also a setup called Open LCA Nexus, and this is primarily around software. You need to have a license to use OpenLCA, but it is free to use, so it's worth registering, and it's just so that they can keep a track on who's using it for what, and that's offered by Green Delta, who have a relationship with EcoInvent. So there's lots of help out there, and Gavin will talk about more shortly. If we go on to the next slide. To finish up, I just want to say, tread carefully. This is very complicated, but you can do it step by step. So do be forensic when you're scoping out your boundary, your system boundary. Be very, very thorough in defining the impact phase. It's a bit like having an environmental management system when you're looking at aspects and what are the impacts. There's no difference really. So a lot of the terminology might be new, but a lot of the concepts aren't. Be really thorough in completing your literature review. Engage with your suppliers as far as possible, but do be prepared to hit a brick wall, because you may get so far down your supply chain and find that you can't go any further. The questions you're asking your suppliers of some of your materials and components haven't done the work themselves. They haven't gone down there to their suppliers. Use established tools to help you. Apply the international standards. They are your best friend. And most importantly, get help as and when you need it. A lot of this is about being collaborative and sharing. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. That was really informative. And like you, I find images extremely helpful in explaining quite complex things. So fantastic. Thank you. I think we now have Gavin Milligan.
Thank you, George. And I'm going to spoil your day by using lots of words and fewer pictures, so sorry about that. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about LCAs in a more granular sense, so picking up on some of the points that Carol's just gone through. You can see the image on the right there. That's the parent standard, effectively, of the one that's been mentioned. Essentially, what a life cycle assessment is, as Carol has already alluded to, it's a quantitative process that seeks to provide a model of activities, and this applies to service sectors, not just manufacturing. So it can be done for service industries as well, and enables comparisons between potentially products or choices that might be made by organizations to replace one option with another. Carol's talked about the standard data sets, and that does lead to a risk of limited accuracy. And we'll come back to that in terms of some of the pitfalls when you're looking at actual data. And I think there is perhaps a little bit of a misunderstanding about LCAs, that they're about numbers. Actually, they're about systems. The numbers are simply there to represent the system when you conduct the overall assessment of product, services, or whatever it may be. So next slide, please. So if you're looking at products, you would define the product, and actually this also applies to services, as a functional unit. So the functional unit might well be a car, if you're talking about a manufactured item. It might be a night stay in a hotel. It might be a cup of tea. And there are all sorts of ways that you could qualify those. And again, we'll come back to that. But that ISO standard defines the functional unit as essentially the consumed item, if you like. And you have to have something which is measurable and definable. So not just a night in a hotel, because the implications, the resource implications of a night spent in a Travelodge in Birmingham versus a night spent in a 7-star hotel in Dubai are very different. So if you're talking about the hospitality sector, and you're looking at a comparison between nights in hotels, you have to be very clear what type of hotel is involved, and the same is true for manufactured items as well. Carol's talked about system boundaries, and we'll come back to those later. And the purpose of the functional unit is to allow comparability. So you can say, what is the carbon footprint of a night in a Travelodge in Birmingham versus the carbon footprint of a night in a 7-star hotel in Dubai? And of course, you also have to think in the broader system, as Carol has already mentioned, what is the purpose of that hotel stay? How did you get there? So inputs and outputs within the LCA must be related to the functional unit. And in an ideal world, it would always reflect realities of what goes on the ground. So I've made a note there, not all driving conditions are equal. So 100 miles, should be a bit more European, a bit more global, 100 kilometers travel in a car, an electric car in the summer when the battery doesn't discharge quite so rapidly versus the same distance traveled by an electric car in the winter. Clearly, you need to take into account, in that case, the climatic conditions, whether or not the road is wet, which will affect traction, and therefore how far the vehicle can travel on a given charge or a given tank full of fuel if it's an ICE. Next slide, please. And when you think about systems, as Carol has already said, the important thing is the boundary. You define the scope of the life cycle assessment. You've already seen some terms, and I've got some more coming up later. How much of the life of the product are you really interested in? And in reality, many studies aren't really full life cycle assessments. They are partial life cycle assessments because they only look at part of the life cycle. And in fact, specifically relevant to the conversation that we're having here today, you can measure many variables and many types of environmental impact, but very often people think particularly about global warming potential and carbon footprint. As Carol's already said, any given value chain has got multiple steps. Obviously, some pictures here to please George, so you can focus on this slide. But if you're conducting a comparison of the environmental impact of delivering milk in glass bottles or plastic bottles, in a sense, the milk is irrelevant to that process because it's the same milk in those packs. So you can discount in many studies parts of the full life cycle because they can be taken as being equivalent, although you need to be a little bit careful not to discount things too readily. Next slide, please. And this sort of brings home the relevance of carbon and net zero. This piece of work study produced quite recently, asking people, like I imagine those of you who've tuned in today, sustainability experts, pick out climate action within the SDGs, and by inference, carbon as far and away the most important issue. Clearly, it has links to a number of the other SDGs, if not all of them. And that's one of the reasons that the carbon footprint, as opposed to full life cycle, is very often looked at by organizations. Next slide, please. So basically, when you're conducting a life cycle assessment, you can choose if it has to be full or partial. And in this particular case, we've talked about some of the standards which are relevant to carbon, particularly those PAS 2050, as well as the ISO 14067. And that's where you use terms like product carbon footprint, PCF, or carbon footprint to describe what you're doing as a subset of a full life cycle assessment. Next slide, please. And when you do that, sometimes surprises may turn up. As Carol mentioned earlier, you do this to inform yourself about where the important components are, the important features or activities. This study was one conducted by a number of researchers at the University of Sheffield, and you can see 6 different characteristics were included, listed down the right-hand side, explaining the initials underneath each of the 6 bars. The second bar across, GWP, global warming potential, so that's the carbon component. And although it's probably quite hard to read the legend there, the big reddy purple block relates to fertilizer, and this is the impact of producing a loaf of bread. And altogether, the field impact, so fertilizer and then all the other inputs associated with the agricultural component of producing a loaf of bread, come to more than 50% of the total, which is perhaps counterintuitive. We may expect that burning a lot of gas in a big oven to bake the bread is potentially the most significant, but actually the nitrous oxide release associated with fertilizer breakdown and or soil disturbance are the most significant component there. So conducting the LCA helps you find hotspots, which may not be quite what you expected. Next slide, please. And there are 4 stages involved in conducting the life cycle assessments. Carol's talked about the process steps that need to be considered, but within the LCA, first of all, you define the boundary. What are you actually looking at? The second stage, which is called the inventory analysis, is where you look at all of the materials and resources that are associated with what goes on within the boundary, all of the energy and raw materials which go into it. And then as well as the product, there may be co-products and wastes which are related to air or to water or to land. Then the impact assessment is when you look at each of those and establish the environmental burden associated with all of those resources which are consumed or the outputs which are generated. And then the final stage, interpretation, is what you actually do with it. How useful is it? How can you use the information it's produced to improve what you do? Now, of course, it's not quite so straightforward as that. Carol's already talked about sources of data, and again, we'll come back to that over the next few slides. If you're struggling to get hold of reliable data, then you may need to flex what you're doing in the assessment as you go. So you may have to be in a position, or you may find yourself in a position where you're forced to change the boundary because you can't find appropriate information relating to the impact of some of the materials or resources which are in use. And in fact, even those may not be clear at all times. So you need to be flexible when you're doing it, but always bear in mind the purpose of what you're trying to achieve, and don't move the boundary so far that you don't produce anything useful in the context of that purpose. Next slide, please. So the first phase, boundary and scope, Carol's already talked about these. So which pieces, which sections in Ennis's earlier description of the full life cycle from primary material extraction, if that's a mined resource, or growing of agricultural resources, is it what you buy? Is it what you make? Is it what the consumer uses? And when you're thinking about models, whether it's a linear or a circular or a subscription or a sharing economy model, what does that actually mean in terms of how many times an item is used? Thinking about the milk example, you might expect the plastic bottle to be single use, but you want the glass bottle to be multi-use. So you have to consider the consumption of some resources spread across multiple activities, multiple uses. Where is it being done? And there's a bit more information about that on a later slide. The types of impact you're interested in. So for here, where we're talking about net zero, it's likely to be carbon, so greenhouse gases, but there are other measures, as we saw on the slide, relating to bread. And which individual areas of the process do you want to think about? Are you only looking at some aspects of it, or are you looking at all activities of the product or process you're looking at? And how are you going to be describing it? When you're talking about the reason we care about carbon emissions, it's because of the endpoint impact, the fact that there is a global temperature rise, which is the consequence. Actually, what we're looking at by measuring CO2 is a midpoint. It's a pre-indicator rather than an endpoint indicator. And who's it for? How are you going to be communicating it? Is it for internal use? Is it for particular external audiences? Are you making product claims, marketing claims? Do you have to be compliant with regulation? Next slide, please. Analyzing the inventory, well, you map out what's involved, you collect data on the material and energy flows in and out of each step of the system that's within your boundary. So all resources which are consumed and all outputs, whether you want them or not, have to be taken into account. If you're making a product which generates waste, then there is an environmental burden associated with the treatment of that waste. And that waste arises as a consequence of the production of the product. So you have to take that into account. If there are avoided or displaced activities, you need to take that into account as well. If you're thinking about burning straw in a power station instead of coal, well, that straw has a use in the agricultural sector. So something else will then have to be used in place of that straw. So you need to think about the impact of the boundaries that you've chosen and the activities you've chosen. Then those basic numeric metrics, how much, how often, where. It's got to be related to the functional unit, the scale to the functional unit in terms of final reporting, and then therefore in the calculation as you go. Carol's talked about some sources through either public or proprietary databases and searching technical scientific literature. Of course, when you're looking at something related to your own activities, you can actually use your own measurements. You can ask other practitioners who are involved. If you're talking about consumption of a resource, you can go to a manufacturer, provider of that resource, and ask them questions. You have to be sure that the quality of the data is suitable. And I can't see the last line on the slide, but I'll assume it's really insightful and important. Next slide, please. So looking at the impact assessment, you take all of those flows that you've measured, you convert them into the appropriate indicators. Again, for our purposes, almost certainly going to be a CO2e figure. And you look at where you're going to get the information from, what kind of standards there are. There are all sorts of standards available. Many of you, I'm sure, will have used the DEFRA conversion standards in your SECR or other reporting. There are slightly more esoteric types of impact outside carbon, where you might need to go to specialist databases for toxicity or other impacts. And then all of these are aggregated into the final metrics that are applied to your functional unit. Next slide, please. So then the big stage is, having got the numbers, the so what question. You need to be careful about the quality of data. And again, we'll come back to that. Where are the gaps? Are those gaps relevant? Is the information actually temporally relevant? So is it still in date? As these things do have a use by, as we'll come back to. Is it reliable? If you're looking at a piece of information about a product which is produced by the trade association which represents that product, that may have a different level of trustworthiness compared to an independent scientific review. Is the data relevant in your particular geographic circumstances? And how does it compare with other ways you could have looked at it? So it's always sensible to have another go. If you're doing a top-down or a bottom-up, just compare to see whether or not those numbers actually come up with an equivalent answer. Okay, next slide, please. So here's a standard from the GHG protocol with some sort of categorizations of how they define the quality of data over a number of different characteristics there. So very good is something which uses the same processes, is recent, applies to the same area, and has the same boundaries. Something which is poor is where you don't know how something was conducted, the data is old, or you don't know how old it is, you don't know where it happened, and it doesn't cover representative processes. So you need to take that into account when you're thinking about certainty or uncertainty of the data you're producing. It would be unwise ever to produce an absolute number because of all of these uncertainties and variables. Next slide, please. So in summary, as you can see from the diagram on the right-hand side, which tries to, maybe is that a useful picture, George, or is that too complicated? I don't know. So when you look at something like that, it summarizes all the inputs and all the outputs, all the process stages and the boundary which has been defined on that list on the left-hand side, the steps very simply that you go through to make sure that you are going to be using information which actually is worth using at the end of it. Next slide, please. So by way of illustration, on the right-hand side there, you've got carbon intensity of electricity generation in 4 European countries over a period of time. Significant decarbonisation has occurred within some of those economies as a consequence of moving away from fossil fuels towards renewables. France, substantially lower because of the nuclear generation. So if you're thinking about comparing an activity that took place in 1990 in the UK versus one which took place in 2020 in France, you need to be very clear that there are significant differences in the electricity which is used. Even on the face of it, electricity might seem to be one thing. And of course, the implications, the longer term implications, typically we're thinking about carbon impact over maybe a century, but the long-term implications of nuclear generated power mean that there are some really unknown unknowns, potentially for thousands of years. So those are not going to be factored in this diagram to the carbon burden associated with generation. And on the left-hand side, just an illustration of real-world circumstances, as well as the electricity used to boil the kettle, depending on the country in the world in which you find yourself, or the year in which you made the cup of tea. How much water did you boil? You might have a cup that's 300 milliliters, but how much boiled water sits in the kettle? Have you used a tea bag? And if so, how many cups did you make with that tea bag? What other ingredients are involved? There's no such thing as a cup of tea. Cups come in different sizes. Has the milk been sitting in a fridge, for instance, which is another source of emissions, which is a consequence of choosing to drink tea with milk in it, and so on and so on and so on in terms of downstream. And if you think about a number of different outputs, the term attribution is used. So if you have different outputs that go away in different directions for different end uses, then you need to think about how much of the resource consumption you're going to attribute to those things. So if you grow apples, some of which are consumed as whole fruit, some of which are processed into I don't know, apple puree for pie filling, some of which are crushed to make apple juice. Which components or which part of the resources you consume are going to be attributed to each of those outputs? Next slide, please. And over to Carol. Thank you.
Hello again. I'm going to talk to you about a case study that we did for Henkel Dylon. Next slide, please. And the premise was that it would be better to re-dye a pair of jeans, black or navy blue, and re-dye a white t-shirt to black or navy blue, than buy a new item. So the premise was that using Dylon dyes is much better from a carbon emissions perspective and overall sustainability than just buying new clothing, which our gut feeling felt was right, and it was the right question. Next slide, please. So we looked at these two particular types of dye, velvet black and intense navy. They were most popular, or are most popular, with Dylon's UK customers. We did a lot of secondary research looking at available literature around the production of jeans and t-shirts. We had to look across the high street to find a representative type of gene, because as you all know out there, depending on the brand and depending on what you're looking for, there are different things other than denim in the makeup of the pair of jeans. And we're looking at just at the fabric itself, none of the fasteners or studs or anything like that, or the thread used, just the denim fabric, and found a representative range of brands where the fabric used is 90% cotton. So that's what we went for as an average pair of jeans. Did the same with a t-shirt, 100% cotton t-shirt, not organic, but run-of-the-mill cotton. Defined what that was. Did our research. I've listed sources of information here that, if you're in the fabric or apparel industry, are really worth looking at. There's an awful lot of information there. We also got a lot of good, very specific LCA data looking at denim and cotton t-shirts. Dylan also asked us to look at household items like bedding, and so we're looking at cotton sheets, cotton duvet covers, and again try to identify what we meant by the average size, a double duvet size as opposed to smaller single, or to look at the emissions associated, the impacts associated with the production of those items. The primary research we did was to go back down through Dylon's R&D team, down into their suppliers. We had permission from Dylon. They paved the way for us to talk to their suppliers to find out how the dye pod was made. It's a plastic dye pod. It's an easy to recycle, completely recyclable component, and it's made up of primarily recycled plastics. We also looked at the sticker or the shell casing with all of the merchandising information on it. I can't think of the word. The wrapper. Took that into account as well. We also looked at the dyes, and that's where we hit a bit of a brick wall, because the providers of the dyes felt that it was commercially sensitive information and wouldn't give us information about the dye stuffs themselves. And Gavin, being a chemist by training, was able to find good secondary information that we could substitute for that, and that was made very clear in the rationale for the system boundary and the data set. So next slide, please. Oops, next slide. Yeah. We were also asked to look at a viscose rayon cotton mix trouser. And this is the system boundary we put together for that. And it shares the same setup as it did with the cotton item system boundary, where we didn't include the point of purchase. So emissions associated with customers going to buy the item, taking it home, and the in-use phase, because whether you've re-dyed a pair of jeans or you're just using a pair of jeans, it's the same use cycle, so that wasn't relevant. The only time that we looked at the wash cycle component is of the dyeing process itself at home, and took that into account as part of the primary research element in using the dye pod. Viscose rayon is very interesting, because there are big variations depending on where the timber for the cellulose to make the viscose rayon comes from. And cellulose comes from timber either grown in parts of Europe, and I'll give an example of that, or it can come from bamboo grown in Asia, or it can come from eucalyptus. Eucalyptus is a fast-growing timber, is great for producing viscose for the fashion industry. And again, one of these unintended consequences, there's a lot of cellulose coming from eucalyptus grown not in Australia, but in South America, because it grows well in South America, but it's doing a lot of damage being escaped again from the it's not part of the natural ecosystem in parts of in South America, and for example in Peru it's becoming a bit of a weed. It's also been grown for timber. It's a cheap timber to use in construction. Most people build their own homes, and you're finding eucalyptus forests growing in places where it shouldn't be. So as part of the global trade, that's an unintended consequence. But again, depending on where the textile processing is done, there are consequences, because the main energy source in the Far East, in China, could be fossil fuels, it could be coal, or again, if it's being processed in Europe, in a Scandinavian country, you're virtually carbon neutral. So it's not so much where was my garment made, because you can see here in the process diagram, the textile manufacturing is much further on from the raw material production and the initial processing. So a garment made, most jeans for Europe are made in Turkey, and that's not where most of the emissions are arising from. It's way back down the supply chain. So this is a really good example of how very global the apparel industry is, and how very global the supply chain and the variations in the kind of levels of emissions are that you have to bear in mind. So next slide, please. So our main findings were that the UK and European textile markets for cotton and viscose are truly global. And talking about the eucalyptus cellulose conundrum for viscose rayon, Tencel Lenzing, which is trademarked, is produced in Europe under very sustainable forestry conditions through low carbon energy systems. So if you buy anything that's Tencel Lenzing, you're onto a good thing. There are some great reports out there. A Measuring Fashion from Qantas was a very good source of information. And also, again, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who've done a global review of the impacts of the apparel trade, looking again, particularly at cotton items. So brands looking at focusing on the transportation impacts, the logistics and packaging of their products. Yes, it's worth doing, but you need to look at the product itself and what that's made of. That's where your biggest impacts are. So yeah, get as much information as you can from the transportation aspects, but that's not the main place to start. It's go back down the supply chain. Next slide, please. And the overall results were, surprisingly, cotton and rayon viscose have similar greenhouse gas footprints. Cotton is much more in the growing of the cotton crop, and viscose it's much more in the chemical processing. Again, it depends on whether you're going for viscose made of something that goes back to something like eucalyptus, or it's coming from a sustainable forestry setup, invariably in Europe. And then we had the difficulties in getting the dipod pigment details and their country of origin, but this just confirms that there needs to be much more transparency from a supply chain perspective. And even when you're doing your life cycle assessment, if you come up against those blocks, that's a good thing. At least you know then that there is opacity there that needs further work, and then you can figure out what's the best strategy for unlocking the information that you need. Thank you. Next slide. So the ultimate was that 20 kilograms of CO2 emissions are produced when you make a pair of jeans or a t-shirt, surprisingly, and that if you re-dye and don't buy new, you're saving a hell of a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. The average consumer in the UK tends to keep their item of clothing for around 3 years on average. If you can make that to 6, you're saving a lot of carbon. If you can make it even longer, I have items of clothing in my wardrobe that I've had for 20 years and they're still going strong. Buy the best that you can, keep it and look after it for as long as you can. And when you get rid of it, make sure that you can recycle it. And that's my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I particularly enjoyed the graphics and the images in that one, Gavin. Okay, so now we're moving on to Stephen, who's going to tell us all about the work that's been done there at Tisix. So over to you, Stephen.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you. My name is Stephen Carhenny. I'm Managing Director and founder of Tisix Limited. We're going to move on to something slightly different in terms of the analysis and then how do you do something about net zero, and how do we prove that we do something about net zero, which is why we engaged JRP. So Tisix is delivering lightweighting for net zero aviation. There's a lot of publicity at the moment about the impact of aviation and what's going to be done to actually decarbonize it. People want to fly more. Global flight is increasing. Aircraft are becoming more efficient, but we've got more planes flying, so something has to be done. We're working with some major aerospace players, Airbus, Safran, Rolls-Royce, and similar people with the space sector. Next slide, please. So this little tube, hopefully you can see this and see it on the image. It weighs about 35 grams. It's about 250 millimeters long, so it's the same as a packet of crisps, but it'll carry 5,000 kilos. That's an African elephant, 2 Indian elephants, and it's materials technologies like this that will transform CO2 reduction in aviation. We have to do things differently to reduce the amount of carbon that aircraft generate in flight, particularly as flight and travel increases. Can I have the next slide, please? So we're focusing on landing gear. Landing gear is heavy, it's metallic. You can't use carbon fibre, you can't use lightweight materials that have traditionally gone into other parts of the aircraft. It's very highly loaded, as you'd expect with landing loads. And because it's heavy, it contributes about 5% to the weight of the total weight of the aircraft, and that leads to more fuel burn in flight. That's expensive fuel and very expensive in terms of the effect of CO2 emissions. Because it's generally steel, because it needs that high strength. It also has a lot of maintenance issues for the airlines, and that increases the cost. So our solution is something that is much lighter. So by making our titanium composites, we can take out 40% or more of the weight of those steel components. Now, taking that weight out has a huge impact on the impact of landing gear on carbon emissions. If you think, you need landing gear when you take off, you need landing gear when you land, but the rest of the time it's effectively just burning fuel. It's just mass to burn fuel. So when we can reduce the weight of that, we reduce the cost to the airline, because we reduce cost, fuel burn and fuel costs. So about £135,000 a year per aircraft less fuel burn. That's a significant benefit to get technologies like ours into aircraft. 40% lighter, and it's more durable because we use titanium. So what's the overall impact of that? So we looked at that and we calculated by some standard trade industry measurement techniques about 3.7 million tons of carbon emissions a year across the twin aisles, the wide-bodied aircraft you use for intercontinental flights, across the fleets of that. That's a huge amount of CO2 reduction if we can get our technology throughout the landing gear system. Could I have the next slide, please? So for us as a company, we need to get our technology out there, oh, sorry, back one. There we go. So we're starting with landing gear because it's a major impact from weight saving. We're looking at wing components, we're looking at engine components, and then we're also working on reducing the impact of hydrogen emissions, reducing the impact of aircraft emissions through hydrogen storage and fly zero emission aircraft, and then future blended wing. For us, this has to be a commercial thing as well. So start with landing gear, grow our business up to the point where we can not only do aircraft, but we can do energy systems and maybe automotive in the future, and actually deliver those carbon savings. Next slide, please. So we've been really fortunate. Last year we won a significant contract from Innovate UK to develop a landing gear part, and Ricardo on the right hand side is holding a full size landing gear component, because you have to demonstrate this great technology is deliverable at real component size. And we've been working with Safran Landing Gear Systems. They're one of the biggest, if not the biggest, landing gear supplier worldwide. Their response on looking at technology, their chief engineer's response, is that it is a game-changing technology. It is the only technology they can see to really make significant differences to the weight of landing gear. And working with partners like Safran and Rolls-Royce, we can get this technology out there and we can start delivering CO2 emission reductions now. It's a technology that's here and ready to implement on current aircraft as well as future aircraft and future systems. Can I have the next slide, please? So the trick is a lot of technologies out there that can really impact net zero flight and net zero in other sectors. And the UK has to be able to not only demonstrate those technologies, but deliver those technologies into products. And that's where, Tysex is obviously focused in getting technology out there. We've got a great opportunity to deliver our technology through aviation and through other sectors. Aviation's a good one because when we go to investors, we can talk about a 20-year product lifetime. So we know our revenues are stable once we get this into products and into aircraft, and then we expand into other sectors. So we've got a plan now to deliver this technology against landing gear, scale our current research base in Farnborough up to a much larger industrial production facility, and get the technology flying, pilot plant in 2024. Now, back to the CO2 bit and why we engaged JRP. It's very good for me to have a view that this is a fantastic technology for delivering emission reductions, but we have to convince our customers and the wider community that this is real, and JRP are able to look at our technology with their experience on emission reduction, life cycle analysis, and validate some of our numbers. And Gavin's about to give you some of the results of what they've looked at. And I think some of their data suggests that actually we've underestimated what the benefit could be. Now, our benefit is in the flight cycle. So there's still work to do in terms of the production cycle, the through life cycle, the full end of life side of it. But our life cycle benefit for 20 years of flight on an aircraft is huge. So the other things do have to be addressed, but overall we think the impact from flight outweighs some of the impacts from the manufacturing end of the scale. So I think over to you now, Gavin, but thank you very much.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just to sort of illustrate what Stephen's just been saying, this graphic, just for you, George, this graphic demonstrates the significance of long-haul flights. Now, Stephen particularly mentioned wide-body twin-aisle planes. They're not used evenly around the world. Actually comes back to what I was saying earlier on. They are disproportionately used in Asia compared to Europe. Lots more single-aisle planes used in Europe. But you can see on this image that the impact of that relatively small proportion of flight numbers taking off or landing in Europe compared to the carbon component is very significant. So this is kind of a hot spotting and focusing on those bits that are the most relevant. Next slide, please. So what we did, of course, as Stephen has just described, the weight change in the item was quantified, looking at the current design, which is that side stay that you saw in the image, and then looked at extending that to other components within the landing gear in the first instance, and then had to try to come up with some kind of sensible measure of the impact. So how many aircraft were involved, how often and how far do they fly, and then look at the lifetime benefit in terms of how the passenger profile is likely to change in terms of the number of people flying. As Stephen has said, that the number of aircraft that are flying is essentially a function of the number of people that want to or can afford to fly, and more people want to. And also SAF, which is sustainable aviation fuel. There is an over time, as with all sectors, the air transport sector has its own targets for achieving net zero, which is strongly dependent upon sustainable aviation fuel, and a move away from fossil fuel based aviation fuels to other sources, of course, will remove some of the embodied carbon in the fuel. But there's a significant chunk of their net zero ambition, which is under the umbrella heading of new technologies. And what Stephen has just described, of course, is one of those new technologies. Next slide, please. So, operational impact. If we just looked at the side stays alone on current wide-body fleet, now in reality, that's a relatively unlikely thing to happen, retrofitting on all of those aircraft. But that would be a relatively modest saving of somewhere between 1/6 and 1/4 million tons of CO2e. So that's run into each year. Future fleet and extending it to full landing gear, obviously excluding the tires, but the metal components of the landing gear would change that radically to a figure of maybe 10 to 16 million tons per year, and that allows for some implementation of sustainable aviation fuel over that time over the coming years. It's expected to be maybe around 70% of the component of net zero by 2050. But if you look at what airlines are saying about the expected uptake by 2030, 2040, it's a relatively modest component. But as it is deployed up to 2050, then the impact of that deployment increases decreases, I should say, the embodied carbon in the fuel, and therefore the benefit. But there is still a significant benefit. The reason I'm quoting a range there is we use two different models to establish the impact, looking at different organizations' descriptions of typical flight distances and typical number of flights per aircraft per year. We used only one measure for number of aircraft. And of course, if you start looking at some of those variables, the more variables you have, if you take all of the low end of a range to produce the bottom end of an output range, you take all the high end of a range of each of variables to produce the top end, you're going to end up with a range which is so wide the error bars are bigger than the measure. So you have to make some judicious assumptions about how you're going to use some of those variables. And the reason I have that image on the right hand side is, as we all know, the size of whales is an internationally recognized standard, and that 6 to 10 megatons of CO2e avoided per year works out to essentially, broadly, a forest, an established forest the size of Wales' annual carbon uptake just from landing gear on aircraft, which makes you wonder if the sector can achieve lightweighting and technological impacts on the other 96% of the aircraft, what the impact could be more broadly. So some of those other areas Stephen was talking about, implementing this technology beyond landing gear clearly has a massive potential. And next slide, please. Over to you, George, I think.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. I mean, I've seen these slides, obviously, and I still learn every single day, and certainly on a specialist area like this. Fascinating, and thank you to all the contributors. Purely from my personal perspective, I just find this absolutely fascinating and interesting. So just to conclude, The circular economy is an industrial system that's restorative or regenerative by intention and design. You can read these for yourself, so I'm not going to do that because I think that's just not very interesting. But I would say that my summary would be that LCAs are applicable to any service or any product. And it's really to get away from this cradle to grave design and towards a cradle to cradle design. So you're designing out any waste. So avoiding waste. This isn't about minimizing waste. This is about avoiding altogether, and that's through designing the product, the service, or the system in a much better way. Carol and Gavin both talked about the various ISO standards that are applicable, and the past 2050, of course, and how the criticality to set the system boundary, to understand what it is you're looking at, whether you're going all the way back to the raw material extraction, or how far you want to go. There were 5 basic steps that were described in terms of an LCA. And of course, carbon LCAs cover all 3 scopes, scopes 1, 2, and 3. We finished up by talking about the real commercial opportunities. Obviously, Carol touched on the Redye Don't Rebuy campaign by Dylon, and there were some absolutely incredible numbers in there. Just only 10% of adults between, I think it's 20 and 50, if they only avoided buying 1 new pair of jeans a year by redyeing an existing pair, that would have a significant impact on emissions, etc. And of course, cost to the end customer, because the cost of the dye is far, far less than the cost of a new pair of jeans, particularly a branded pair of jeans. But of course, from a Dylon perspective, that also meant that they were generating, I think last year alone, they generated new sales revenues of about £18 million. So it's not an insignificant commercial benefit to the client. And then, of course, Stephen was telling us, and Gavin, about the LCA work that's recently been completed for them. And that is absolutely astounding, the impacts, even in the short term, let alone the potential in the future. In terms of the emissions reductions that could be realised by using the material in a wider sense, not just within landing gear, but perhaps in the future throughout other parts of the aircraft. Absolutely fantastic. But of course, again, that also exemplified really clearly there were benefits, commercial benefits to everyone involved. So there were benefits to the airlines in terms of, I think the number was about £135,000 per wide-bodied aircraft per year. In terms of reduced fuel costs, etc. And of course, there were also benefits to TISIX themselves in terms of additional sales revenues, and probably being quite conservative, well of £250 million. Those are big numbers. So you can understand why Mark Carney said what he did, and the quote is there: "The net zero represents the greatest commercial opportunity of our time." It really does. And I think apart from that, it also enables you to get a much better understanding of your own supply chain and your own services or products that you're producing, to understand how you can do it better and how you can truly make your organization, your business, truly sustainable in every sense of the word. So thank you for that. A link to this recorded webinar will be made available. And I think, Jane, do we have any questions that need answering in the broader forum?
There have been several really interesting questions posed, George, and they've been answered as we go along, but I think it's worth just going over a couple of those again, because just in case people haven't spotted them, if you look in the Q&A in the answered tab, there's one that from Jim Cunningham says, how does LCA avoid the moral hazard of being commissioned by the company that wants to sell the product, such as setting narrow system boundaries, which I think is a really good question. Carol, do you just want to reiterate your response to that? Carol, I think you're muted.
Yeah, if I can find it. Is it in the chat?
It's in the Q&A.
Hang on.
If you look in the Q&A in the middle tab, the answered.
Okay, Right. Apologies for the delay to everybody. The answer was, so how does a company avoid the moral hazard of, how does it avoid the moral hazard of being commissioned by the company that wants to sell the product? And I said, ultimately, if a company wants to use its LCA to help sell their product, then the study has to stand up to scrutiny. If company LCAs are not made available, you have to ask the question, why not? So my advice to business who realise that they need to know much more about what they're selling is to quietly get on and do the research, analyse the results, and consider what the implications are for their business. This should then inform their business strategy and supplier engagement going forward. The more you know, the more you can manage. Sorry, that just had a message pop up in front of what I was reading. And if you feel that there's an issue, but you don't do anything about it, and you're just like being an ostrich sticking its head in the sand, this issue could come back to bite you later on. It's much better to know what the issues are and do something about them. And you may at the same time find, as George just recapped now, there could be some big opportunities for your business by knowing more about the foundations that it's sitting on. So business longevity and market share are ultimately at stake, and by knowing more and doing more, you can secure a better long-term future.
Do you want to take any more questions, George?
If there's any that you think are absolutely relevant, then I think we've got time for maybe one more.
There's a new question.
You want to take that one then, Carol?
Yes, you had a question about how exact should the evaluation of Scope 3 emissions be when every company in the supply chain does it separately without having a common booking process along the whole supply chain. We talk about the supply chain and we have a linear picture in our heads, but it's actually a web. And very often you'll find that in a sector, a lot of businesses getting information from one core supplier or is actually going back to, when you go back down, you'll find that several suppliers are all getting resources from one or two vendors. So it's important to know how those connections are made in your supply network. I think that's a better way of looking at it than a chain. And using not just, and we've talked a lot about standards today, using good procurement standards, applying the ISO 2400 sustainable procurement, using certification processes like Ecolabel and Ecotex, other standards, can help to bring rigor and good practice into the procurement process. And it's important, I think, to collaborate and share, and where there are common problems within a sector, within a business, and there are a number of suppliers involved, it's important to work together. By working together, you end up with a better result.
Thank you, Carol. I think we've just about run out of time. So thank you everyone for attending, and thank you particularly to the contributors today. Some fascinating insights in there, and hopefully everyone got something from that. We will make a recording of this available to those that would like it, and anyone that would like some more specific information or have specific challenges or questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you everyone and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Take care.